No one anticipated the startling family secret that would surface in midair when Barron Trump relinquished his first-class seat to an elderly veteran. The entire plane was stunned by what transpired next. As everyone took their seats, the cabin lights flickered dimly, and the air was filled with the typical pre-flight tenseness and minor mayhem. Flight 214 to Newark was completely booked on this morning at Washington International Thurgood Marshall Airport. A young man sitting in first class was among the passengers. Many knew his face right once, but his expression indicated that he hoped they wouldn't. Now a teenager who was more than 6 feet tall, Barron Trump was reading a hardcover book in silence by the window. Although he didn't spend much time in the spotlight like the rest of his family, the name on his boarding pass guaranteed that he would inevitably draw notice. A man in his early 80s shuffled into the economy area across the aisle. He had his boarding pass in an old leather duffel bag, his silver hair brushed perfectly, his back slightly bent, his stride purposeful. As the man walked by, passengers looked at each other. His military jacket, which was covered with worn patches and medals, conveyed a tale of sacrifice and service. While others merely marveled at the understated nobility in his gait, others talked to one another, curious about his past. He sat down toward the back of the aircraft, sandwiched between a restless youngster and a chatty businessman. The flight attendants, meanwhile, made sure everyone was seated for takeoff by moving quickly through the aisles. A shiver of tension ran through the air as the cabin door shut. Visibly agitated, the elderly veteran's seatmate said he required a change seat. The hubbub caught Barron's attention from his cozy first-class seat as the veteran apologized for the inconvenience. His brows furrowed in contemplation, he leaned slightly into the aisle and watched the spectacle develop. Then silently, he hit the flight attendant's call button. When she got there, Barron murmured quietly, "Excuse me." The flight attendant looked in shock for a second before asking, "Can I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" First-class passengers looked up from their tablets and newspapers, intrigued. The young Trump's offer was surprising, particularly in a society where privilege was frequently accepted without question, but his tone and demeanor were uncompromising and sincere. The attendant walked quickly toward the back of the plane and said, "Let me check," with a tone of surprise in her voice. First-class muttering increased when Barron got up to get his carry-on luggage. Across the aisle, a woman leaned in his direction. When she added, "You don't have to do that. You know you paid for this seat," she sounded a little stumped. Barron just shrugged and grinned. Some people deserve it more. The entire flight would be altered by what transpired next. A few moments later, the flight attendant reappeared with a look of appreciation mixed with curiosity. She told Barron, "He said he'd be happy to switch," with a little shudder in her voice. Not many people willingly handed up a first-class seat, much less a teenager with a well-known name. With a courteous nod and a smile, Barron picked up his suitcase and started down the little hallway. Some passengers nudged one another to corroborate what they were seeing, while others muttered as he passed. Some even went for their phones and took discreet pictures. Barron appeared indifferent to the attention, concentrating only on the man who was now sat close to the back. The old veteran looked up, perplexed, when Barron arrived. His voice was rough but powerful as he questioned, "Are you sure, young man?" Barron said, "I want to," and held out his hand. "You don't have to do this for me." The veteran paused for a second as though considering whether to accept the gesture, but it was clear that Barron was sincere when he said, "Thank you for your service. Please take my seat." The man stood slowly, giving Barron's hand a strong shake. "Well, thank you. That's mighty kind of you." The muttering among the passengers became more audible as the veteran headed to first class. "Did you see that? He just gave up his seat," a young woman in row 15 said to her adolescent daughter. The gentleman sitting next to Barron glanced over and arched an eyebrow. "Never seen anything like that on a flight," he said to himself in a whisper. Barron shifted his tall stature to suit the narrower economy seat, which was suddenly empty. Despite the sporadic looks from other passengers, he appeared totally relaxed. Barron just shook his head and opened his book when a flight attendant casually asked if he needed anything. Once more in first class, the veteran sank onto the soft cushion, clearly overcome by the unexpected warmth and comfort. His hands shaking a little, he adjusted the armrest. A flight attendant came up to him and offered him a warm blanket and a free drink. The young man said you should have this seat, she clarified. The veteran gave a small smile. It's been years since I've been treated like this, he said. He turned to see Barron sitting quietly in the economy section, apparently engrossed in his book. Despite its modest deed, the gesture had a huge impact. The stress of boarding seemed to release a momentary breath from the cabin. The plane taxied onto the runway after the passengers had settled in. The narrative was far from done, though, as the engines roared to life and the aircraft took off. What appeared to be a straightforward act of generosity was about to take a turn that nobody could have foreseen. The veteran then spoke. The gentle hum of the engines filled the cabin as the aircraft reached cruising altitude. The scene was anything but ordinary, as flight attendants passed through the aisles carrying snacks and beverages. Travelers couldn't take their eyes off the elderly veteran, now sitting in first class in Barron Trump in the economy section. Admiration had been expressed in whispers, but the story was just getting started. At first, the veteran sat peacefully, drinking water and gazing out the window while holding his hands in his lap and showing the slightest sign of tremor. Then, as though forced by the gravity of the situation, he looked at the middle-aged woman with the gentle eyes sitting beside him. He said, "I have to say something," in a voice that was hardly audible. The woman gave him a questioning glance. With a heavy sigh, the veteran fixed the Purple Heart, a tiny button on his lapel. The woman blinked in amazement as she said, "That young man who gave me this seat, his family saved my life." "What do you mean?" the veteran asked, leaning back and starting his story with a steadier voice. "It was decades ago during the Vietnam War. I was stationed overseas, far from home with no family support. I'd been injured badly, shot twice in the leg. When I finally got stateside, I was lost. No direction, no purpose, nothing." Even if his voice faltered, he went on. "I ended up in Jersey trying to rebuild my life. I didn't have a place to stay, barely enough money for food. One day I ran into a man outside a diner who saw me struggling. He didn't just hand me $1 and walk away. He sat with me, listened to my story. That man was Donald Trump's father, Fred." A few other passengers who had been quietly listening in drew closer as the woman's eyes widened. "Fred Trump?" she had inquired. The veteran nodded, his face turning to one of longing. "Yes, he didn't owe me a thing, but he made sure I had a roof over my head and a job to get back on my feet. He never asked for anything in return, just told me, 'You serve this country, it's the least we can do.'" I'll never forget those words. By this point, a number of first-class passengers were interested in the talk, and the tale started to spread across the cabin. The veteran's eyes were glistening with gratitude as he continued, his voice growing louder. "I always wanted to thank his family, but I never got the chance. Life moved on, and I thought the moment was lost forever. And now today, that man's grandson, he's given me a gift I'll never forget. What are the odds of something like this happening?" Barron sat in economy, unaware of the increasing commotion around the aircraft. His long legs were clumsily curled into the small area while he read a book. In first class, however, something more profound had been triggered by the veteran's disclosure. The passengers started looking at each other, and their astonished whispers spread like wildfire. A flight attendant leaned in the direction of the veteran. She whispered, "Would you like me to tell him what you just shared?" After hesitating, the veteran shook his head. "No, not yet. Let the boy have his peace. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me. Not right now." The passengers, however, were unable to control their surprise. As though the cosmos had come together specifically for this moment, what had begun as a straightforward act of kindness suddenly bore a sense of destiny. Then an even more amazing thing occurred. For a short while, the veteran sat in silence, his tail hanging in the air like an unsaid challenge. Passengers nearby looked at one another, some bending closer to whisper their own thoughts. The flight had changed from being a simple trip to something much more. The man who broke the hush was the one sitting right across from the veteran. His face was worn yet friendly, and he was in his early 50s. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he added in a steady but emotional tone, "but your story really hit home. My grandfather served in Vietnam, too. He used to talk about how much it meant when people back home cared enough to help. Hearing what Fred Trump did for you, well, that's rare. Too rare." With a slight smile on his lips, the veteran nodded. "It's the little things, son. People don't realize how far a small act of kindness can go. Back then, I thought my life was over, but that man's generosity gave me a second chance. A young mother who was holding a sleeping toddler in her arms spoke up across the aisle. You know, my dad used to say the same thing. He wasn't a veteran, but he always told me that when someone lifts you up, even just a little, you pass it on. It's like a chain reaction. What Barron did today, it's proof that kindness still matters. As he listened, the veteran's eyes softened. It's true, and it's not just about big gestures. Sometimes just being seen, being acknowledged can change everything. That's what Fred Trump did for me, and it's what his grandson has done for me again today. Each story the travelers told was more poignant than the one before it. A flight attendant sat on the armrest of an empty seat close to the veteran, clearly moved. I wasn't planning to say anything, she said, but my brother served in Iraq. He didn't talk much about it, but when he came home, he told me that the people who stopped to thank him or help him out in small ways, those were the moments that stuck with him. Sometimes those moments were the only thing keeping him going. The veteran gave a nod of comprehension, his face displaying a mixture of modest pride and empathy. Your brother's right. It's the little things that keep you grounded when everything else feels like it's falling apart. Barron saw a few people in economy looking back at him with a look of wonder and appreciation on their features. Although he was still unsure of the entire situation, he gave one woman who smiled at him a courteous nod. No one on that aircraft could have foreseen the series of connections and reflections that resulted from his seemingly insignificant gesture. The veteran looked at the flight attendant and replied, You know, I've always believed that gratitude doesn't just stop with the person who helps you. It grows. Fred Trump helped me rebuild my life, and I've spent every day since trying to honor that by helping others. Today, Barron reminded me of that mission. It's funny how life works, isn't it? Everyone was a little startled when the plane encountered a turbulence patch, but the atmosphere in the cabin stayed consistent. The discussions resembled a collective catharsis, as though there was an unseen thread of compassion, thankfulness, and human fortitude tying everyone on board together. And the most surprising thing of all happened as the plane started to descend. First-class talk slowed as the plane started to descend into Newark. Deep in contemplation, the veteran sat with his hands folded and gazed out the window. Some people were still in awe of the unexpected turn of events, and others exchanged knowing looks across the plane. The flight attendant, who had been listening earlier, came up to Barron in economy just as the pilot announced the final approach. She whispered quietly while bending slightly to meet his eye level. I wanted to let you know that the gentleman you gave your seat to, he shared something extraordinary about your family. Would you like to hear it? Curious, Barron raised his head from his reading. Slowly, he closed the cover so that no one nearby could read the title. Sure, he said simply, in a calm yet interested tone. The attendant paused, perhaps trying to find the proper words. Years ago, your grandfather, Fred Trump, helped him when he was at his lowest point, she continued. Your grandfather gave him a place to live and a job, expecting nothing in return. And today you did something for him that reminded him of that kindness. Barron remained silent for a moment. Although he maintained his composure, his eyes softened as if the realization were weighing heavily on him. That's something, isn't it? He asked at last, and the flight attendant grinned. It is. I thought you should know. The veteran waited ready to disembark as the jet touched down. To everyone's surprise, he went straight to the economy area, looking at each row until he found Barron. The young man looked up, startled, and got up to get his suitcase. The veteran held out his hand. Young man, I wanted to thank you face to face. What you did today, it brought me full circle. Your family has a history of kindness, and you've carried that forward. Never forget how much these moments matter. With a solid handshake, Barron spoke in a steady yet low voice. I didn't do anything special, sir. You deserved it. The passengers were listening to the exchange with rapt interest, and the cabin was now quiet. Some wore tiny, reflective smiles, while others had tears in their eyes. Despite being generations apart, the bond between these two guys seemed to be a real example of the strength of appreciation and empathy. Many of the passengers stopped as they departed to express their gratitude to Barron for his act. The veteran was approached by others who shook his hand and expressed their appreciation for his service. No one has ever witnessed such a vibe on a flight before. The veteran tipped his hat to Barron at the gate and turned again before heading out. "You've got a good heart, son. Don't ever lose that." Barron nodded, his normally formal manner slightly softening to convey the word's significance. He took out his phone and typed a quick message as he made his way to baggage claim. After he paused, he sent the message. "Grandpa would have been proud of today," the text said. This tale serves as a reminder of how a single act of kindness may have far-reaching effects and bring people together in unexpected ways. The qualities of kindness, thankfulness, and empathy are those that cut beyond space and time and forge enduring connections. Remember to share this tale if it inspired you. Let's continue the discussion and remind everyone that compassion is still important. Remember to subscribe if you want to see more stories like this one, and we hope to see you on another amazing adventure soon.